Trapped by Mau Mau Terror, by Robert Silverberg, told to you by Edward E. French. Everyone in the British colony of Kenya knew that trouble was coming because the Mau Mau were on the warpath and an epidemic of killings had broken out. Hardly a night went by without one of the white settlers meeting a bloody death at the hands of the enraged Kikuyu tribe, which had risen under the Mau Mau name to throw off the yoke of European domination. My family has had land in Kenya for generations, but I had been living in America and England for most of my life. I had returned to Kenya in 1952, just after my 30th birthday, at the request of my uncle. He wanted me to manage a middle-sized farm near Nairobi. Having put in a spell in Korea, I was looking for some peace and quiet. What nobody told me was that Kenya was on the verge of a bloodbath that for a while threatened to make the Korean War look like a game of tiddlywinks between Oxford and Cambridge. On the night that the incident I'm about to recount took place, I couldn't have been in a more vulnerable position. I was the only white man on the farm that night. My teenage cousin, who had lived there with me, was out on a Mau Mau posse. We had drawn lots, and it had fallen to me to stay behind and guard the homestead. My only company that bloody night, aside from my two massive Great Danes, were 3 loyal natives, the cook, the houseboy, and a porter. It had been a bad week. Just the other day on the lower Kabiki Road, on the far side of Nairobi, a white man and his wife had been hacked to death. A couple of crusty old bachelor farmers had had their heads chopped off at dinner time by their own houseboy. Chief Waruhui, the loyal native leader known as the African Winston Churchill, had been shot to death in his car by terrorists. A Kikuyu city councillor had been murdered. Over in Thompson's Falls, Commander Jock Mickelson had been shredded by Mau Mau blades, and his wife horribly mutilated, but not killed. And at Nanyuki, an entire family, mother, father, 7-year-old daughter, 6-year-old son had been cut down. Only the girl survived, but her legs had been severed, and she had been raped 12 times. Not a pretty thing, this Mau Mau business. And if I told you of the oaths the Mau Mau took in the forest while devouring entrails and eyeballs and genitals plucked from live goats, it would turn your stomach. Let's just say it was sheer deadly savagery. All the terror of Africa's black barbarism rolled into one. And there I was, that night. Already more than 12 white settlers had been murdered, and I don't know how many hundreds of loyal natives. Kenya was full of British soldiers. The jails were full of natives. Settler posses roamed around in big bands looking for troublemakers, and still the killing went on. On Christmas Day, a note was found pinned to the skin of a dead African, declaring perpetual war on the white man and his black supporters, and announcing that the Mau Mau would claim 12 heads before New Year's Day. They went one over their quota. After each killing, they left behind souvenirs, Mau Mau symbols, disemboweled chickens, strangled cats, cows whose udders had been hacked off, sheep whose eyes had been plucked out and impaled on thorns. They weren't content to murder settlers. They wiped out farm animals as well. It was a messy business. We figured out that some 90% of the 1.25 million adult Kikuyus had gone Mau Mau. They came down from the mountains, killed and looted and burned, and ran back to their hiding places. This night that I was alone, I had an inkling that there was going to be trouble. Our farm was pretty well isolated from the rest. Just down the road a couple of miles was the Brewster farm, but they were our only neighbors. There were 2 of them, Mike and Sally Brewster, who had come out to Kenya from England sometime in the late 40s. Mike was a red-faced, beer-swilling English type, not very long on the brains department, but extremely good-natured. So good-natured, in fact, that his wife, Sally, had cuckolded him a few dozen times. Never with me, unfortunately, and if he knew about it, he didn't seem to mind. She was a girl of 28 or so, with flaming red hair and enormous breasts and mocking come-hither eyes. I had settled down for the evening. The wireless was bringing in the BBC. The fire was blazing. There wasn't any electricity or central heating inside the house, and on the porch a lantern was glowing, by command of the Kenya Police Reserve. The idea was that if the lantern went out, it would be a signal that something was wrong, and the inhabitants of the farm needed help. I had mixed up a pitcher full of martinis, a habit I developed in America, and I had a good book open. Just a comfortable evening at home, you might say, except that I didn't ever know when a horde of black-skinned devils would come rushing in and hack me to pieces. I had a .45 strapped to my hip, and there was a hunting rifle propped up, fully loaded, at every window. Just a quiet evening at home, you see. My cousin Hal, out riding with the posse, was due to return home at midnight. I had to hold the fort until then. Everything was quiet until along about 9:30, when Sophocles, the bigger of my two Great Danes, suddenly fetched up from his place in front of the fire and started to prick up his ears and growl. I was alert instantly, knowing the range of his hearing. My 3 supposedly loyal servants were in their quarters, but you never knew when a man loyal for 20 years would suddenly turn killer. Going to the window, I peered out into the lantern-lit darkness. I was surprised to see a jeep pulling up in front. A woman got out, looked around carefully in all directions, and sprinted toward my porch. As she passed the lantern, I could see her plainly. It was Sally Brewster. Her heavy breasts bobbed wildly as she ran. I threw open the door, admitted her, and slammed it shut. "Sally, what are you doing here? Has there been trouble up your way?" "Not yet," she said, panting to get her breath. "But there's noise in the hills, as if they're going to come down and make a raid. And I was all alone." "Alone?" I repeated, astonished. She nodded. "Mike's in Nairobi with some friends. He was supposed to be back at sundown. He might be dead or—" Her face hardened scornfully. "He might be lying drunk somewhere. Either way, I was alone except for our native boys, and I didn't like it. So I tacked up a note for him and came over here. Do you mind?" "Don't be silly. I'm all alone, too. I'm grateful for your company. Care for a drink?" "Yes, please. Thanks. Ever so much." I poured her a martini, and she sat down opposite me in the big chair. I had to admit she was a remarkably attractive woman. She wore jodhpurs that clung tightly to her hips and buttocks, and her breasts jutted forward from her white open-collar blouse. The red glory of her hair tumbled about her shoulders. We had a couple of drinks, and she moved over next to me on the sofa, and I realized she was in an amorous mood. It was a devil of a situation. She kept getting closer and closer, and finally she took my hand and slipped it into the front of her blouse. She had no brassiere on, and I found myself holding one of her big breasts, the nipple, stiff and hard, pressed into my hand. She was beginning to pant. "It makes me feel relaxed when a man holds me there," she said. "With this Mau thing, I need to be relaxed." Well, I didn't mind relaxing her, and I knew what would inevitably follow. But I didn't want to share the fate of that couple up near Lamuru. They'd been spending the evening together under similar circumstances, and there they were, naked as jaybirds, having each other on the floor, when the wogs burst in. One of the Mama boys pinned the couple together with his sword, driving the steamy through the man, through the woman beneath them, and into the floor. That was the way they were found dead when the woman's husband and some friends came in. Man and woman were still locked together in the act of love, as well as by the sword. I didn't want to have that happen to me, but it might have, if the attack had come 20 minutes later. As it was, I was sitting there palming those heavy breasts, and Sally was getting hotter and hotter, when suddenly the front door was smashed open, and an immense native carrying a steamy in one hand and a club in the other came crashing in with a short, stocky one right behind him. Never in my life did I disentangle myself from a wench so fast. The big bruiser came straight at me with his knife out in front of him. The other took out towards Sally. The dogs came bounding off the hearth and got into the general confusion. My gun was in my hand, and I put a bullet into the big fellow's chest at a range of about 8 feet. A .45 packs quite a wallop at that distance, and the impact knocked him back against the door. A third native came in, tripped over his fallen comrade, and I shot the newcomer in the middle of his face. Meanwhile, Sally had gotten up off her seat and was struggling with the short, stocky one. He was holding her tight with one hand and had the other in the air about to slash her with the steamy when Euphrates, the younger of the two Great Danes, went into action. He bounded across the room, a gray-violet blur, and took off like a gazelle, soaring through the air and opening his jaws wide. He got a grip on the native's sword arm just above the wrist, and I heard a horrible crunching sound. The sword went clattering to the floor. For an instant, I couldn't do anything, because the dog was hanging onto the native's arm, and I didn't want to shoot Euphrates by mistake. But then the mau-mau swung around, lifting the great beast completely off the floor, but in the process presenting his back to me. I put a shot just above his shoulders, and nearly severed his head with it. Then a fourth one came in. He saw that we had the situation pretty well in hand, and he turned, trying to get out. Sally had her gun out by this time, and she winged him in the shoulder as he turned. He went toppling forward, staggered for a second on the porch. Her second shot blasted him back of the ear, and he fell forward into the rose garden. For the first time since the attack began, we had a breather of perhaps 30 seconds. I heard the sound of scuffling behind the door to the left, and I knew there were more mau-mau around somewhere, giving trouble to the houseboy and the cook and the porter. At least, that was what I thought. But I got out into the passageway just in time to see Congo, our cook, pick up his meat cleaver and bury it in the skull of Wapaga, the houseboy. Brains went spurting. So, Congo had gone mau-mau too. He was wrestling with the cleaver, trying to get it out of Wapaga's head, fixing to cut me in half next. I started to go for him with my gun, but just then old Sophocles came bounding out, saw what was going on, and leaped for Congo's throat. The cleaver came around and ripped into the dog's neck. Furious, I pumped 2 shots into Congo, and he lay dead over the corpse of my faithful dog. I heard a shot from the other end of the house and hurried there. Sally had nipped someone skulking in the backyard. Euphrates rushed out and got his fangs into a throat out there. We heard horrid gurgling sounds, the sounds of a man's throat being ripped out. Everything was very quiet, suddenly. Sally stood in the middle of the living room, her breasts heaving, the smoking gun at her side. Neither of us had been touched. There were mau-mau bodies everywhere. "Is that the last of them?" I asked. She shook her head. "There's one more. I wounded him, but he ran into the pantry and locked himself in." "Come on," I said. We went into the kitchen. The pantry door was bolted from within. I had installed the inner bolt myself to make the little closet a good hiding place in case of attack, but I hadn't intended it to be used by our attackers. "Give me your gun," I said. I took Sally's weapon since mine was all but empty and she had reloaded. Standing back, I fired a shot through the oak planking. There was a groan within. A trickle of blood appeared below the door. "That'll take care of him," I said. "We'll give him a night to bleed to death. Then I guess we'll have to take the door off the hinges to get him out." "Suppose he comes out by himself?" I shrugged and fired again, aiming low. There was a second groan from within and the sound of a body falling. "He won't come out," I said. We walked back into the living room. The place was a bloody mess, corpses everywhere. Nahanga, our porter, the sole survivor of the 3 native servants, came out. His black skin was a fine shade of green. "All over, Bwana?" He quivered. "All over," I said. "Where were you?" "In the WC, Bwana. Fighting frights me." I made a mental note to get rid of him the next chance I had. Cowards were no use around here. "Help me clean this carrion up," I ordered him. We got together all the mau-mau corpses and piled them in the front yard. The police would be along in the morning to pick the body up and identify it. We took the dead houseboy around back, along with the dead dog. They were on our side, and we would bury them. It was close to 11 by the time the job of piling up the dead and mopping up the blood was finished. I sent the cowardly Nahanga to his quarters. Then I turned to face Sally. Her blouse and face were smeared with mau-mau blood. I remembered that we had been on the verge of making love so long ago. Was it really only an hour before the attack? But it seemed inappropriate, I thought, to try to take up where we had left off when interrupted. But Sally had different ideas. Her eyes were glowing by the dim light of our fire. I saw the lust smoking in them. "You were wonderful," she breathed. "You and that wonderful dog saved my life. And if I'd stayed at my farm, they would have killed me." "I'll drive back with you now," I said. "Perhaps your husband is home and—" "There's no rush." Her fingers went to the collar of her blouse. The blood-stained blouse came off in a moment, and before I could speak, she had unzipped her jodhpurs and stepped out of those. She was naked. Her body stained with blood and beaded with sweat was magnificent. a thing of sheer animal beauty. Her large round breasts rose and fell with the agitation of her desire. She rubbed her palms sensuously against her firm hips. 1,000 protests rose to my mind. The Mau might return. Her husband might come here to fetch her. My cousin Hal could come back. The police might arrive. But the glory of her body wiped out any thought of objecting. She pulled me to her and ripped the clothes from my body like an avenging fury. And there, on the floor, lying in a puddle of Mau blood, we made love. When it was over, we dressed silently. It had been a strange evening, an evening of killing and loving. I got into my Jeep and drove alongside hers all the way back to her farm, and then returned to my own. I learned later that her husband had been drunk in Nairobi that night and did not return until morning. 2 months later, there was another Mau raid on our area, and Sally Brewster was killed. She died a horrible death. The attackers slit her belly open and dragged out her bowels while she still lived, and then they cut off those splendid breasts I had fondled that evening. Sometime later, her husband confessed to me that she had been in the first months of pregnancy. I often wonder if it were my child she was bearing, conceived on that night of blood and lust. I shall never know, of course. But in the 2 years that followed, no one was more dedicated to the ultimately successful task of wiping out Mau than I. And I like to think that perhaps some of the natives I helped to kill were those who had so cruelly slain Sally. Certainly she was heroic that night the Mau attacked, and certainly she was splendid in her love-making afterward. Nowadays, with Kenya as safe as it had been in the days before the Mau terror, I think longingly of her, and wonder what might have happened between us if she had lived. The end of Trapped by Mau Terror, written by Robert Silverberg, and narrated by Edward E. French. That's it for this week's Fiction Fantastique. We'll be back again next week with another one. And I'd enjoy your company then, if possible. The email address for this program is edwardfrench06@hotmail.com. It's all for your delectation. And speaking of delectation, I'm on Instagram at ed.emerson.french. Fiction Fantastique comes to you from the studios of World Brain Audio and originates in Studio Suite G1. So long from scenic Chatsworth, California, USA. Good night.